Jump right in. So, hi everyone. This is the Qualitative Research Online Summit, and today I am here with Jenny. How are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. So, I understand that it is Tuesday and in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, gotcha. It's a sort of dreary Monday afternoon for me. So,
Oh, well, I cannot see a cloud in the sky. It is
oh, that's
glorious.
beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I'll make sure to visit so I can get some of that. So I'm going to jump in with my first question. So, in a scientific climate where most programs centralize quantitative methods, what led you to qualitative research?
I was really lucky in that although my discipline and my department, which is psychology, was very dominated by quantitative approaches, here in New Zealand there is quite a strong tradition of qualitative research. And my supervisor that I got for my master's thesis and the undergraduate lectures that I had where research was presented that was qualitative that most inspired me was kind of it was part of the teaching that we had. It wasn't like mainstream, the dominant by all accounts, but it wasn't kind of sidelined or completely marginalized. And there was no kind of question when I guess I felt really kind of just a natural affinity with the type of questions that they were asking and the sorts of answers they were getting with qualitative approaches. And so when I wanted to do a master's research with it, there was no question that that was inappropriate or non-viable or whatever. So the context really made that possible. And then when I went to the UK and did a PhD, it was in a department that was dominated by qualitative research, a real kind of centre for it. So anyone doing quantitative approaches were in the kind of unusual and minority position, and that was social sciences, so it cut across a number of disciplines. But I think, I hear about people from the States saying things like, I get advised that, this is a bad career move to do, qualitative research, and, will I be challenged on just kind of some of the really sort of fundamental validity of it as a paradigm for research. And so I've never kind of had those experiences. And so I guess I feel like I've been lucky in some ways, don't have to kind of fight for the very sort of starting point. So context, I think, is really important.
Absolutely.
And how we allow for kind of multiple different ways of, generating knowledge and generating understandings of the things that we're interested in.
And what were some of those early questions you were exploring that you knew this would really fit with a qualitative method?
The very first research I was involved in, I bullied my favourite lecturer into taking me on to do an undergraduate research project, which she didn't really, she wasn't wanting to do at all, but I was persistent enough that she agreed, and I count myself eternally grateful for that and for my persistence and her willingness to do it. And that was research looking at ethics around publishing clinical case studies and looking at some of the kind of nuances and subtleties around and it was mixed. It was a mix of kind of qualitative and quantitative, but looking at some of the kind of subtleties and nuance around how you present clinical case profiles, really, and, what counts as, the ethical practice around that. So that was kind of fascinating, and I think qualitative research was vital for getting the stories and the kind of accounts of what people were doing, not in a huge amount of depth, but in a kind of subtle way. And but it was quantitative as well. But my master's thesis was looking at the development of cervical cancer prevention policy in New Zealand and wanting to understand how we had, how there had been no kind of emphasis around the possibility of primary prevention. Now, the context for that's really changed. Now we have vaccinations like Gardasil and, there is kind of discussion about that. But around that time, it was really like we have to rely on cervical screening programs. And very early on, I started to kind of try and understand why this might be and why a link between, say, sexuality and cervical cancer was not being talked about, not being discussed, did not appear in kind of policy or public health information. And I really found that, talking to people and getting those kind of stories and that sort of oral history of what had happened and why it had happened, I guess it's not really an oral history, but it's kind of like that, a narrative of the past. And it allowed for an understanding of the kind of contradictions and complexities of the situation. Mm-hmm. So that real kind of idea that, a story isn't necessarily a tidy story, and it can be messy, but that's kind of reality. Yes. I think sort of allowed, really kind of made me feel very enthusiastic about the possibility for qualitative research. And also, I think one of the things that people talk about is that qualitative research can kind of show you unexpected things, yes. Can, allow you to see things that you don't, imagine in your experimental design or whatever it might be ahead of time to be something that's going on. And that really came up in that research, where I had kind of an imagination of what the stories would be and why the outcomes would be the way they were, but actually the story was quite different to that, and kind of almost in some ways the opposite. And it was some of the women's health advocates in New Zealand who had been pushing against sort of links between sexuality and cervical cancer, which kind of had surprised me, because I would have thought that primary prevention would be being promoted in those forums, and with kind of the best of intentions, but also a very kind of unusual story.
I love that. So I love that unusual story, or the complexities that come out. You called it like the messiness of it. And I think that a lot of students, when they're transitioning to qualitative research, or people who have been trained in a more post-positive paradigm, are really stuck when they get to something that's messy about qualitative. So I just appreciate you highlighting that it's a part of life. And so it will show up in those types of research. So my next question is, it can be mapped onto that a little bit. What qualitative methods have you used, and then which do you prefer?
I think, I've used a number of different methods for data collection, from interviews, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, both ones that I've moderated and ones that have been sort of self-moderated. Mm-hmm. I have done analyses of kind of documents and textual and media material. I'm currently starting to look at some analysis of some visual social media data, but I'm not sure where I'm going with that yet. That's something new and completely different. And then in the last couple of years, I've been playing around with I've done qualitative surveys, which are great for kind of getting broad pictures. But the one that's kind of most fascinating and exciting me at the moment is a method called story completion, where as a qualitative method you present your participants with just a very short start of a story and ask them to write about what then happens. And they don't have to, it's not like what do you think happens, it's more like what do you think, what would happen, what might happen. And they can be as realistic or non-realistic as they want. Most people tend to write sort of realistic stories, but you get fantasy stories as well. And it's kind of, it falls within a cluster of approaches called projective, I guess, approaches where you're not giving your opinion or your perspective or your views or something. You're, I guess, telling a story in relation to a stimulus. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a lot of kind of history of psychotherapy, clinical psychology and Rorschach tests and, those sorts of things. And that this kind of approach has come out of that, and they get used in a more quantitative way in developmental psychology around some kind of attachment theory and things like that. But as a qualitative method, what you then get is a cluster of stories, and we've been sort of theorizing them as giving access to the sort of socio-culturally available ways of making sense of this particular phenomenon. And then you can use the data to kind of access the sorts of ideas and assumptions that are embedded within these stories. And it's very interesting because even the kind of fantastical stories, or the stories that seem so kind of out there, often reflect the same sorts of themes or meanings and ideas that the more realistic stories contain. So the participants seem to quite like the task as well, and it's usually quite a short participation period for qualitative research.
Right.
And of course it doesn't suit any method, so I always kind of, I feel like as a researcher I have the things that I'm familiar with or the things that I'm kind of excited by, but I think I always try and come back to this idea of, what's the best way of getting at what it is that I want to get at here. One of the things, one of the things that we looked at with story completion was around body hair practices. We looked at kind of counter-normative body hair practices, and gender was the kind of focus of this particular thing. And so we had a story with a male character who decides to start removing body hair, and a story with a female character who decides to stop removing body hair. And one of the things that we got in the women's body hair stories was a really dominant theme around body hair removal as a hassle, a burden, really annoying, time-consuming, expensive, on and on and on. And it's really quite different to a lot of the other body hair research, where that kind of meaning just isn't there.
Wow.
And it was a really interesting thing for me as a kind of qualitative researcher to think about, how method also intersects with the sorts of meanings that we have access to.
Mm-hmm.
And so story completion gets at this meaning that makes perfect sense, but doesn't show up as a really dominant idea in lots of the other research around body hair.
What are your thoughts about why the absence of those ideas has been so glaring up until now? Like, what is it about that story completion, that sentence completion projective that unveils some of these stories, these narratives that maybe you might have an idea about or a personal experience with, but we just don't see captured empirically?
I think, one of the ways that we've kind of theorized around it and has been kind of talked about is that you've kind of removed the personal identity of the participant from the data collection process. And so they don't have to think necessarily about themselves and who they are and what their own kind of identity might be or their investments might be in something, but they are given a task of making sense of a phenomenon in a way that they think is, that makes some sense to them, that draws on, wider kind of ways of understanding it or making sense of it. And here, they'd be drawing on ideas about gender and gendered bodies and a whole lot of other things as well. So I think, when you say, if you interview somebody or you give them a kind of a survey to complete, and I've had a student work on body hair and gender and with interview research, and then, we've done some survey research as well. And I think in those situations, there's always that question of, if you're reporting on your own practices, there's always some kind of accountability and some kind of idea of who you are as a person and some kind of presentation kind of experience in the interview that you're doing. And you've got to think about, how you're presenting yourself, whether that's conscious or unconscious. And, there's, we live in most of the kind of global north countries, or kind of Anglo-Western sort of dominant countries, the kind of neoliberal ideas of, the individual agent who chooses and makes informed choices and makes empowered choices about what they do with their bodies is very strong and dominant. And, there's a lot of resistance to the idea that we kind of are informed by, the media or, we are just kind of responding to the social messages about what it is that we should do. And so I think when you collect data in some of those other ways where you're asking people more about themselves, those other things are also going on.
Got it.
Story completion potentially kind of frees the person from having to be accountable in some way to what it is that they're writing about. And they're usually anonymous as well, which probably helps.
Yes. So you kind of gave us a good tidbit about story completion, which is something new for me that I'm now very interested in, because I like projectives anyway.
Yeah.
But choosing one of your preferred methods or methodologies, walk our viewers through your process for initiating, executing, completing, and then publishing a qualitative study. It can be your favorite study or anything like that.
I will talk about the story completion, because I think, it's fun and it's exciting and it's a bit different to some of the other things. So I guess my first step is always to kind of think about, what it is that I want to know about, what I want to understand, and then to kind of think about the best method for data collection and data analysis. I think data analysis is good to have an idea about that beforehand, but not necessarily be kind of wedded to a particular thing early on, because as we talked about earlier, the data can be interesting in ways that you didn't anticipate. So this is a project that I worked on with my colleague Victoria Clark and a few other researchers, but mainly with Victoria. And I'd been doing a bit of body hair research, and we were interested in playing around with story completion as well, and thinking that, here's a topic where there are a lot of very strongly embedded cultural norms around gender and body hair practices, and some suggestion that for men that those are shifting and changing, that there is more flexibility and variability for how they might display body hair within different contexts. Shift is not, a universal thing. And so we started to think of, these norms started to be, so I would, try and get to the essence of what it is that's kind of interesting. And so the norms seem to be the interesting thing. And story completion offers a tool for getting into those kind of norms and ideas a bit. And so with this project, one of the things with story completion is that it seems on the surface like it's very simple. Like you write a little start of a story, and you give them some instructions, and they write the story, and then you've got your data, and yay. But actually, there's a lot of design work that goes in to the story.
Break that down for us.
And so getting a stem which combines, I think, brevity and enough kind of guidance and but also openness is really, really crucial. So, we had, our story stem was something like, Jane has decided to stop removing body hair. But we probably spent days thinking about the exact wording. And then, you have to think about what cues are being set, So, for instance, names, code gender and class, and to some extent age and ethnicity and race. There's a whole lot of things which kind of get coded in a name. So a name like Jane, it's like, well, who does Jane evoke? What kind of imagined person do we have? How much do we want to, in a method like this, how much do you want to kind of signal the scope of the story? How much do you want to leave it completely open? What are the pros and cons of giving virtually no information like we did with that one versus giving a bit more contextualized information? So you have to kind of go through a sort of series of processes and steps to figure out the right amount of information for the stem, and then piloting it is absolutely crucial, because we've had some projects that we've done that have really not worked with story completion, where the stem maybe is too narrowly sort of deterministic of outcome, like a scenario where virtually everybody wrote the same story.
Gotcha.
Because the sort of potential for there to be variability really in the situation that got set up was too limited, or where the participants don't kind of know enough about, they don't have enough kind of resources to draw on to kind of tell a story about the particular topic at hand. But something like body hair is a good one because it's so kind of almost, it's a universal topic, people could write about it. So piloting would be absolutely crucial. Data collection can be really quick. That's one of the advantages. Like you can do it online with story completion. Depending on your ethical situation, the ethical process might be more straightforward. Some kind of non-sensitive, anonymous projects can go through a quicker ethical review process. It depends on the institution. We've mostly had to go through standard ethical review processes because our topics tend to not be non-sensitive. But so I think, so there's a lot of kind of design work that goes in ahead of time, but then the data collection can often be quite quick. And most of the recruiting for that particular project we did through participant pools. I think participant pools are problematic if they're relied on too much as samples. But in our instances and for this topic, young-ish university students seem to provide a reasonable enough sample for that particular topic. So then I would compile all the stories, and most of the analysis that we've done so far with story completion, and for this project we did a couple of things, but would be some kind of thematic analysis, which we've also done a lot of work on. And so kind of a process of kind of reading, coding, starting to map patterns, and really sort of trying to shift from sort of very summative and obvious sort of identification of patterns of meaning to some of the more kind of overarching or underpinning kind of patterns. And I had a student working on this project, and she was great at it was her honours project, and she did a really nice job at kind of identifying patterns that cut across both the David and the Jane stories. So even though the stories on the surface were quite different, but kind of seeing how at a more sort of fundamental level they were about the same kind of process or the same kind of purpose or the same kind of outcome. So one of the themes that we identified was around the sort of benefits of going against the grain, the personal benefits. So Jane's benefits were things like more time, more money, less hassle in her life, whereas David's benefits were things like being more heterosexually attractive or being a better athlete or something like that. So quite different, but actually still underpinned by a similar conceptual idea. One thing Victoria and I have also done a bit is trying to kind of map the stories and map the way. So sort of starting to shift a little bit to thinking about, is there something more narratively interesting going on in these kind of data? Now, the stories tend to be quite short, so I think, there's a real good question for how useful are kind of more narrative types of analyses, but I think that's an exciting future development. But we have sort of started to look at mapping the stories.
When you say mapping, can you break that down for people?
Yeah, Victoria did a project, so a different project, which looked at a young woman coming out to her parents. And in those stories, the stories were very much divided up into a kind of start, a middle, and an end, in a very sort of typical story structure. And what tended to happen was that in that instance, Victoria kind of mapped three trajectories that you could come out to your parents, and they either had a kind of a neutral, a positive, or a negative, reaction, I think. Now, this is me trying to remember the details of it, so I might be getting it wrong. But I think, what the story mapping showed was that if the story started off like this and then went to, this particular initial response, it could go a number of ways. Mm-hmm. But if it went to that particular initial response, it wouldn't go then a certain one of the possible outcomes. So the kind of process of mapping is starting to look at whether there are, I guess, sort of typical story trajectories that get told and that get understood, like if X happens, does Y, is Y always kind of understood as a kind of consequence, which sounds in some ways quite quantitative, but it's more about, I think, trying to understand the kind of stories about consequences that might be available socioculturally for people. So how do we understand the likely outcomes of a particular type of scenario? And, for a topic like coming out, for instance, that has consequences for, if someone comes out and their parents respond in a certain way, if the broader sort of narratives around what that means, those broader narratives about what that means will have consequences for how the person can make sense of and understand that experience, how the parents can, it's not kind of inconsequential, I guess. So I may be remembering the details of that that analysis slightly wrong, so sorry, Victoria, if I have. But it's really about, that process of trying to kind of understand kind of narrative trajectory, really. Right. But I think in terms of those broader narrative questions, there's also questions of kind of narrative style or genre or many of the other features. Neither of us are narrative analysts, so we're analysts, so we're kind of not expert in that. But we would love other people to kind of be part of that conversation.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you were picking up from the mapping, and then you were going to, like, when you're completing it and you're writing it up, publishing it, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting question. There hasn't been that much published on qualitative story completion. There has been a bit. Our experience of like writing it up would be to write a very sort of, I guess, a standard research report and send it off. We've had quite mixed experiences in getting things published, I think, because it's a method that's unusual. It raises questions for some people. I think a lot of people who are qualitative researchers, or maybe not very expert, but sort of there's a lot of attachment to qualitative interviewing as like the best method for getting data. Don't get me wrong, qualitative interviews are absolutely wonderful, but I think, some people can have an over-reliance on the interview as the way to get qualitative data. So I think there's not much. So our experience has been that we've had published studies, but it hasn't been as kind of, I guess, an easier road as some other, like if we'd done a qualitative interview and then analysed it thematically, that feels like it would be a more straightforward process. We are working on a special issue of a journal at the moment, qualitative. I'm just having a complete blank. Qualitative research in psychology. There we are.
There we go.
And that's focused around story completion.
Oh, wonderful! I can't wait to read that.
Yeah, so we're publishing the body here papers, but we're also publishing things like an interview with one of the first person really to kind of push this as a qualitative method, and a kind of discussion around it, and maybe some commentaries and a whole lot of kind of empirical projects, as well as more general guidance. And since you suggested that we should plug our books, we did also write a chapter on our very recently out collecting qualitative data, which is trying to focus on some of these kind of less common methods of qualitative data collection. And so we've got a chapter on story completion in that as well.
Oh, I can't wait to get that one.
Well, it'll be very interesting to think to see what you think about it, because we're kind of excited about it, but we're also interested in what critiques people may bring as well. one of the things that people say about qualitative data is, that it's so rich and it's so, as I talked about at the start, the nuance, the complexity, the often the contradiction. And we've kind of encountered some criticism, like I did a presentation last year and someone said, these data seem so thin and nothing to me, I don't think this method has much to offer. And it's interesting because actually working with these data sets, I would say the opposite. Even though the stories might just be a paragraph long, actually when you start to kind of drill down into them, there's often, I think if the stem is designed well, you can get real richness and real complexity in the data. Mm-hmm. So I think, that key feature of qualitative research is also there, but just in a quite different form. You see it in a different way.
Yeah, I'm excited because I was talking to someone else about like having to create methodology if you have a specific question and other methods aren't answering it in the way you want. And so you guys are using this work from, who was the person that originated it?
Celia Kitzinger, who's a psychologist in the US, and we were very lucky. I think we both had her as doctoral supervisors.
Oh wow! Yeah.
And she is someone I think who is kind of characterized by a kind of inquisitiveness around research and inquiry, and I think she really instilled that in both of us.
Well, I was gonna bring it around to my first interview was with Adrian Coyle, and he talked about thematic analysis. And I was wondering if you were going to talk more about that, because you guys really popularized and almost standardized this as an analytical approach. And so I'm wondering, in the context of my fourth question, like, do you operate from a specific research paradigm? And if so, does that inform your inquiry? So you have different methods that you might use, but I wonder if your analysis takes different forms or whether you guys deepen and develop your thematic analysis approach to work with all these different methods.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll answer. I'll comment on thematic analysis, and then I'll come back into the bigger question of an approach. I think with the thematic analysis stuff, it's been a great process for kind of thinking and writing around method and reflecting on how you write around method and how people understand method. And I think one of the things that's happened with thematic analysis is that as it's become sort of more widely popular, I think people maybe just utilize it, some people, without kind of fully engaging, like it gets kind of said, you've got to read this, or this is what you're doing. And, I think one of the frustrations that Victoria and I have is that we often see people using thematic analysis and then doing exactly the opposite of what we say. And, when we initially wrote about it, we were writing in a context that was, what's that now, 12 years ago. There was very little about it. And now in our subsequent writing, we are much more kind of, I think, nuanced or more refined in the sorts of ways we frame things and the way we talk about the whole field, really. And that, but you get a lot of people who maybe just read the 2006 article and nothing else. Yes. And I think what we have now is a situation where there are a number of different approaches to thematic analysis, sometimes called something very similar, and that they are quite fundamentally different in approach or philosophy or ideas, but they can get all kind of mishmashed together, so it can get treated as a method that can sit outside of philosophy, theory, methodological framework, and somehow these kind of fundamental differences don't necessarily matter. And so one thing, for instance, is that there is some thematic analysis writing which advocates the use of a code book and almost kind of predetermining themes and developing a code book to identify those themes. And that, that sits in a very kind of realist and positivist framework, and it assumes that the themes are waiting there, that you can kind of know ahead of time to some extent what those will be, and that, it comes with its own set of procedures, methods, theoretical assumptions, commitments, and so on. And that's really quite different to how we've talked about it, which is as a method, but also flexibly applied in a whole lot of ways, but also really committed to the themes being a kind of outcome of the process of coding and theme development, rather than being kind of predetermining or predetermined as you kind of go into the analysis. But you get, I think, and so we didn't write about those differences early on because those weren't so apparent and weren't so understandable. But nowadays, there's enough of a body of research that those differences matter. And if people aren't sort of aware of them, they are doing, they end up doing qualitative research which is conceptually muddied or, actually quite problematic in terms of a mix of assumptions. Or they'll say things like, I followed Braun and Clark and I did, I used my code book, and we're like,
yes.
No, you didn't. So what we've done recently, just last year, was late last year, we kind of put together a much more kind of comprehensive checklist for reviewers and editors, but also for authors, researchers, to kind of say, look, these are the sorts of things that you need to be really clear on, and these are kind of some of the quality criteria that you need to be looking at if you're reviewing an article that says, I use thematic analysis. Well, what approach are they talking about? What sort of theoretical and methodological processes are they building and relying on here, and are these all consistent? And so we also we thought that we were clear about, needing to have a broader theoretical framework for your research. But it turns out that for some people that wasn't clear enough. And I think, we really emphasize that now that, and I think we've started thinking about our version of thematic analysis as kind of a reflective version or reflexive version, where you actually have to think about how you're doing it and what frameworks you're situating it in. And I think really one of the fundamental questions in that is, what you think your data represent. What are they giving you access to? Do you think you're accessing people's experiences, their true experiences, their real experiences? Do you think you're getting access to their sort of discursively informed constructions of the world? And those are really, quite fundamentally different things that you can theorize and understand qualitative data as giving you access to. But it's often the case that that isn't specified or that isn't clear. And that's one of my kind of key things I think that's really important, is kind of having that understanding, being really thoughtful, going, what do I think this is giving me access to? To kind of come back to your question, my choice of analysis method is always going to relate to that question, what is it that I want to be able to make claims about, and therefore what method of analysis will I use? Now, I think thematic analysis can be used in or our version anyway, can be used in for lots of different types of questions and lots of different ways, giving us access to lots of different types of data, but we really need to be clear about that. And I always kind of can't help myself sort of seeing the world from a more constructionist point of view, seeing meaning as kind of socially located, socially produced, not necessarily, the sort of data that you get from people is not necessarily about their true experiences, but about the kind of meanings and frameworks that exist broadly. But that's not always what I'm interested in when I research. So it's always about kind of, that's kind of my starting point. But then it has to come back to, what's the most useful framework, what's the most useful thing to be getting from this particular research question. Why am I doing the research?
Yes.
What is the purpose of it? So I think it's good to kind of reflect on and recognise our own kind of, I guess, I don't want to say biases, because I don't think they're biases, but our kind of, the things that we're kind of drawn to, or almost and kind of constantly reflect on those and go, why am I, is this the best approach right now? Is this useful in this particular instance? And to be open to other ways of doing things.
And so you start with a method and analytic approach, and then the data are messy and they have nuance and all this complexity. Do you ever go back in and be like, I'm going to analyze this a different way because this analytic approach is speaking to what I see now, which I didn't expect to see, but now I need to, go into it and explore it differently?
Yeah, I think to come back to the body hair story completion project that we were talking about, so we've done this sort of like thematic analysis that's looked across both data sets. And I think that's really a good analysis. I think it's kind of showing something that's really interesting going on. But when I actually started to look really closely at the stories, I was really struck by the kind of micro use of language and the very kind of sort of extrematizing language and the kind of micro constructs that were in the data rather than these broader things. And, it made me go, actually, I'd really like to come back and do some really kind of, fine-grained discursive analysis on these stories and really look at the language and what's happening with the language use here. So I think that's a good example of where the data themselves started to kind of suggest something other really interesting going on. And I think it also highlights, your question's a really good one because it highlights the fact that qualitative data can tell us different things, if we have different questions. And in the last few years, I've had a few people kind of say to me, I've submitted this article to this journal and they've come back and they've said, you've published from this data set before, so you can't do that. And, the sense in which, you've got your data set and you've got one analysis that you can do and then that's it. And that's ridiculous. Any qualitative researcher knows that you can ask different questions and get different answers from that data set. So I don't know where this idea of just one study comes from, but it's problematic, especially if you have very different types of questions.
I'm looking at data that I collected 3 years ago in a new way. One, because I'm a different person than I was 3 years ago, and also because there were questions that surfaced that I was not looking for at the time, and now I'm like, I'm ready to attend to those things, and so I'm wondering if that process will come up as I submit this new paper. And it's like, well, I had to submit the paper that I had published first, and then compare it. Yes, and so I don't know what that process is going to look like, but it's something that you spoke to. I wanted to ask a really logistical question because this is one I hear a lot, and then it'll lead into the last question. So with that study, with the sentence completion, how many people completed sentences? I hear that so much, and we talk about saturation and we talk about all these ways that you can say, okay, now's the time to stop collecting data. But I wonder for you, how is that process dictated, or how do you know?
I think that is the big question of qualitative research that we are facing right now. Sample size, so much. We get so many emails from people asking about this, and and in the textbook we wrote, successful qualitative research, we kind of tried to produce tables of saying if it's this sort of study and this sort of data, but it's like, to some extent it is. How long is a piece of string? And there's so many kind of parameters at play, and we disagree. Victoria and I disagree around these things as well, but we also find that we tend to be pushing our students to collect more data than some other people. I think I'll come back to the thing about saturation because that's an interesting one. But for story completion, for instance, there's one of the things that it can allow you to do is kind of comparison as well. So you can have different groups of participants completing the same story, or you can have two different versions of the story like we did. And if you have a large enough sample, you can start to go, well, is there something patently different about these stories versus these stories? And so in that one we had a 3-gender category, but we only got male and female participants. But then we had male and female versions of the story. So we could break it down into sort of 4 groups if we wanted to, or we could just treat it as 2 data sets. Or I think, I don't think there's value in doing those comparisons by and of themselves. But what I'm getting to with that is that you need a larger sample. Mm-hmm. So the sample size to some extent depends on whether it's just one stem and you're treating your sample as just simply giving you that information, or whether you want to think about whether, you might you might be wanting to look around something like class, and you might want to see, do working class identified people tell different stories than, middle class identified people around this particular topic. So, and in the published literature around story completion, there's huge amount of variation from a relatively few number of stories through to, hundreds and hundreds of stories. I think to some extent you do need to kind of balance out the fact that the stories are quite short, with a greater number of those stories, because qualitative research is also about telling a rich story about data, telling a complex contextualized story about data, not just a simple summary of key features. So I'm not giving you an absolute answer here, because
I don't think really there is one, but I was
wondering. I think I would also say with if I'm supervising student projects around this, that, you have to think about, is this something that I ultimately might want to publish, or, we might want to publish, and if so, how big a sample do we need to have? One of the advantages of, methods like story completion is that you can collect the data relatively quickly, so, that adds to the potential for a larger sample size. I think in our body hair project, because we also had UK data and New Zealand data, and I think we had about, I can't remember now, at least 150 stories from each country. So a fairly large, for qualitative terms, a fairly large sample size. But I think that to come back to that kind of point about saturation, we started to kind of talk about this a little bit. I think it's very pervasive in qualitative research as an idea, but it's really, I think, problematic if it's treated almost as a universal standard. And it's treated quite, because it's almost treated as if it's something that's not tied to a particular theory or particular idea of data. It came out of grounded theory, but the way it's used is often completely different to those sorts of things. Now, that's not necessarily problematic if people are aware of how they're using it and what they're doing, but it also kind of, it's problematic also in that it almost suggests that, you can know in the point of data collection what is a saturation of ideas, but how do you know that before you go analytically into the process, right? As we talked about, your analysis can take you all sorts of different places that you didn't anticipate. And so saturation kind of, in that way, often sort of almost seems quite a surface reading of meaning in the data. I think there's lots to unpack around it. And so I think that's a really important conversation, and there's some good critiques around it that kind of highlight some of those tensions.
Yes.
But it kind of it's become one of those acceptable shorthands.
It is.
My data reached saturation, and it's like people don't question that. They don't say how it reached saturation, why, how they counted that, how they established that. I've probably done this myself many times. Reviewers want you to do it. They want it to be in there. So yeah, I think it's that one is also ripe for a good critical discussion alongside sample size.
It's the one thing that I feel many of my more quantitative colleagues feel like they can say and know something about. They're like,
Yeah.
and did it reach saturation? And I'm like, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean?
Yeah. You tell me what you mean, and then I'll tell you
exactly.
A, if it's happened, or B, why it's wrong.
So I have one more question. What's one tip you'd like to share with qualitative researchers that you think that you want them to hear from you, maybe informed by your experience, or you might have even heard it from someone, but through your experiences doing this work over time, you've shaped it in a way that really is unique to you?
I think this is a really good question, and when I was thinking about it, I think for me the most important thing is kind of being really reflexive as a qualitative researcher, and being constantly open to your assumptions and to try and understand what those assumptions are and how they're shaping the research in particular types of ways, and your identities. Both the identities that you're aware of and the ways in which you are potentially being read and positioned and understood by other people in the research process. And so it's about kind of recognizing yourself as key in the process, especially if you're collecting data from people where you're interacting with them. But also kind of recognizing that in subtle and other ways you are constantly shaping what it is that you're doing, and seeing that not as a weakness, because I think there are, for some qualitative researchers and in some contexts, there is almost a sense in which we have to make our research unbiased. We have to show the ways in which our subjectivity has been, excised from the process, when for me, I think I would increasingly say that subjectivity is absolutely vital to what it is that we're doing and how we analyse our data and how we make sense of it and the types of understandings that we can have. But I think there's still a sense in which somehow we should be, lab scientists kind of desperately trying to remove ourselves from the process. But I think if we own that subjectivity, and this isn't unique to me as an idea, many people have kind of written and talked about this, if we really own it and think about it, not that we have to write endless papers about it, but in the process that it becomes a kind of key criteria for us to think about quality of process, quality of output for qualitative research. I think it's really important. And that's not just saying, I'm a white woman who interviewed, this participant group and therefore, but actually going much, much deeper than that. And to think about the assumptions that we have in the types of questions that we ask and what we give space for people to answer, or how we give space for people to answer questions or not. And how we react when we see or hear something which is quite different to that which we've kind of assumed, and thus kind of reveals our assumptions in those moments. So I think it's kind of like fully owning that as part of the process, I guess, would be my comment.
Thank you so much. First, for sharing all your wisdom and spending this time with me today. And I just want to say, in that last moment, I was like, oh, there's so much good there, but I want to respect our time. Like, I wonder about, and this isn't a question, but more of a statement. I wonder about what aspects of ourselves do we need to interrogate in our subjectivity, and what parts do we need to say, this is valued, because it hasn't been present in inquiry before, because people haven't named these identities or these positions as scientific at all, and it just made me think about like how I write subjectivity statements and what I want to include in them and why. So the value of that subjectivity, I really just appreciate that. But thank you in general.
Yeah. I think that's really important, because it is, as you say, it's a process of sort of validating some things but still keeping other things invisible or out of the conversation, and through how we do that. Yes.
All right, so that has been our Qualitative Research Online